The general historical record holds few, if any, examples of a person or a government being improved by long periods of unchallenged power. Beyond a certain point, the folks in charge run out of energy and ideas, which is bad enough, but they tend also to start thinking and acting like they own the place. It is King Louis XIV of France, who occupied his throne for 72 years, who is credited with, or blamed for, the quip, "L'État c'est moi," I am the state. President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan of Turkey has not ruled quite that long, a mere 22 years as either Prime Minister or President. And the palace he has built himself in Ankara isn't quite as grand as Louis's pile at Versailles. But Erdoğan is, and not for the first time, displaying signs that he believes supreme power is something to which he is exclusively entitled. Last week, Turkish police arrested Istanbul's popular mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, who is also, probably more pertinently to his current predicament, the nominee of the Republican People's Party, Erdoğan's principal opponents, for the 2028 presidential election. İmamoğlu and dozens of his associates are accused of corruption, among other malfeasances widely supposed to be figments of Erdoğan's imagination. Their arrests have prompted huge protests and severe retaliation from authorities across Turkey. A curiosity of the scenario is that Erdoğan is theoretically not able to run in 2028. He will be term limited. He would not, however, be the first demagogue to have contrived a crisis in order to suspend or alter the usual protocols. But if President Erdoğan is struggling to imagine a future for his country which does not involve him, or indeed revolve around him, it would appear that large numbers of his fellow citizens are experiencing no such difficulty and are being bold in saying so. Why has Erdoğan struck now? Does he plan to install himself as president for life? And can anyone stop him if he tries? This is the Foreign Desk.
It's not by any means a sort of, İmamoğlu fan club. This is the touch paper on something far, far bigger.
Rather than differences, maybe those similarities are more of a reason to spook Erdoğan away. That he is popular, that he has that similar touch, he is young. So when you look at the facts here, he is more of the future of the country than Erdoğan himself.
At this point, he's popular because he's powerful, rather than him being powerful because he's popular.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our first guest is Hannah Lucinda Smith, Monocle's Istanbul correspondent. Hannah, first of all, can you give us a sense of the scale of these protests? I'm sure a lot of listeners will have seen the footage on TV or on social media, but what does it look like to stand in the middle of it?
Yeah, in one sense, it's like going back in time 12 years. I arrived in Istanbul in 2013, just before the Gezi Park protests, and that was the last time that I've seen anything like this in Istanbul. After those protests, there was a huge police crackdown. Then came a political crackdown. Then came the coup attempt against Erdoğan, and a crackdown after that. And over the past decade, there's been this sort of increasing pressure on all kinds of Turks. Arrests over Gezi are still going on. Thousands, tens of thousands of Turks have fled the country. Hundreds of thousands are in prison. And people were scared to protest. There was a lot to protest about: the economy, increasing crackdowns on, freedom of speech, freedom of media. But it was never quite enough to sort of really bring people onto the streets. But the arrest of İmamoğlu, it's litter touch paper. And now when you look at the protests, which are still going on, they're growing night by night. The opposition is still calling people to come to the streets. I've got a kind of bird's eye view. I've been both reporting on the protests and moving house. And as I'm moving house, I'm literally moving 3 doors down on the same street, but the protests are going down my street every night. I live on the Asian side, and there's also big protests here. So, yeah, this is something that we've not seen for a decade. And of course, Turkey's changed a lot in that decade as well. If you go back to Gezi, Yeah, there were a lot of young people who are unhappy with the way that Erdogan was going, but generally the country was going quite well. You know, the economy was still going quite well. Turkey's position in the world, Turkey still was seen as this sort of model for Islamic democracy, something that the countries that were sort of going through the Arab Spring process might, aspire to. And now the economy is going terribly. For the past 5 years, Turks have been dealing with this searing cost of living crisis. Foreign investment had only just started coming back into Turkey in the past 2 years when Erdogan returned to a kind of economic orthodoxy. And now they've fled again. The lira absolutely plummeted a week ago when Imamoglu was first arrested. So he's really, plunged the country back into chaos as well. So I think, it's very reminiscent of Gezi, and it's certainly in a sort of visual sense, even though, Gezi was the millennials protest in Turkey, and certainly this time it's Gen Z's turn. You're seeing sort of, 20-year-old students who were children when Gezi happened going out into the streets now. But I think that, the circumstances in Turkey surrounding it are very, very different.
So has this become one of those things, and it is often the way, that a protest about one thing in particular, in this case, the arrest of Imamoglu, becomes quite quickly a protest against everything in general?
Yeah, absolutely. And when you look at the protests, you see people carrying placards that they've made at home, but also sort of official flags. And you'll see the unions there, different sort of leftist parties, different branches of the CHP, which is Imamoglu's party. But you'll also see people who are sort of aligned with the far right. There's also a very prominent far right politician who was arrested a few weeks ago in Özdağ. And there are people who are very angry about that. So it's not by any means a sort of, Imamoglu fan club. This is, as I say, it's just the touch paper on something far, far bigger. And I think Gen Z in Turkey haven't had a chance to protest. I often thought to myself, well, will there be protests in Turkey again? And really, the anger's boiled over in a way that it did in Gezi. And, one thing I have noticed is this time around, the police crackdown is far quicker. I mean, the Gezi protests, they kind of simmered as a sit-in in Taksim Square for about 3 or 4 weeks, before the police really came in heavy-handedly with tear gas and rubber bullets and cleared the square. And, this time from, the second or third night in, police using swathes of tear gas, sort of continually firing their water cannon at protesters to just drive them back, kettling protesters. In some cases, I've seen video of police, beating and kicking protesters who are on the ground. And also the other night as well, I saw deployed on the streets of Istanbul the Akrep, armoured police vehicle called the Akrep or the Scorpion, which I've personally only ever seen in the southeast in the Kurdish region. I posted it on Twitter, and some people said no, they've seen it in other places as well. But personally, I've only ever seen it in the east. So I think, it's a moment of hope for a lot of Turks. People are saying, finally, this has happened. But I think it's also a tense moment, seeing how far these protests will escalate and how far the crackdown will escalate too.
Is it clear, though, what they're hoping for? As you correctly point out, there are any number of things about which a modern Turk, especially perhaps a younger one, could be discontent. But is there any suggestion from either the protesters or from Imamoglu's own party that here is what we actually do want?
Yeah, I mean, when you listen to what the protesters are shouting, one thing they shout is "Hükümet istifa," which means government resign. And, they want the resignation of Tayyip Erdoğan. Now, that's not going to happen. He's not the kind of leader who, listens to this kind of criticism. And in fact, he's been saying things very reminiscent of the things that he was saying during Gezi as well. He's sort of, accusing protesters of being provocateurs and terrorists and, acting against the interests of Turkey. So he's very, very unlikely to back down. And, he has such a large swathe of the state and the security apparatus under his control. The police, the army, since that coup attempt against him in 2016, he really cleared out the upper ranks of the army. He's hugely expanded the numbers of police. It's very difficult to see how these kind of protests can force a leader like Tayyip Erdoğan to step down. On the other hand, they're sort of bringing out the ultimate crackdowns that they can at the moment with, the use of non-lethal force, also huge, operations against people identified in the protests. There's almost 2,000 people arrested so far for taking part in those protests, and that includes journalists, including high-profile journalists. And in fact, today, the BBC's correspondent Mark Lowen, who was based here in Istanbul for 5 years, was deported from the country. He'd been back for 2 or 3 days reporting from the protests. So it's a real kind of inflection point, I think, in Turkey. And, I've been here for a really long time, and I really don't know which way it's going to go.
Well, on that thought, is there a concern, or have there been concerns voiced among the demonstrators or among press covering this about how far Erdoğan might be willing to go should some sort of crunch come?
Yeah, and, the level of violence that I've seen in some of the videos from the protests, it is shocking. And there was one night when the workers inside Istanbul City Hall were sort of, letting the protesters in because they were being so heavily tear gassed and they had nowhere to run to. They were sort of being kettled in metro station and up against fences. And there was some photographs of, piles of shoes that had been left behind by people sort of scrambling to get out of the crowd. And let's not forget, in Gezi, there were deaths. We call things like tear gas and rubber bullets non-lethal weapons. They're extremely unpleasant. I've been caught in protests where they've been used. Yeah, and the sheer numbers of police are just astounding. I mean, it's any protest in Istanbul or in Turkey is immediately sort of surrounded by a lot of police. But the sheer numbers here are, more than I've ever seen before. So, yeah, it's really difficult to know where this is going to go. I mean, I think we're definitely going to see more crackdowns on media. Also, we've seen today a decision coming from the broadcasting board placing a 10-day ban on Sözcü television, which is one of the few opposition television channels left. Other journalists, as I said, have been arrested. I think we're going to see far more arrests of, people who've been taking part in the protests. And I think Erdoğan is going to probably try and keep a lid on it that way.
Hannah Lucinda Smith, Monocle's Istanbul correspondent, thanks for joining us. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Ekrem İmamoğlu is not the first mayor of Istanbul to have been arrested and imprisoned before going on to seek national office. In 1997, a previous mayor of Istanbul was arrested and convicted over a public reading of an allegedly inflammatory poem and disbarred from the mayoralty. His name was Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. It is unclear whether or not the irony has occurred to Erdoğan, who also pitched his detention as political persecution. It is certain, however, that President Erdoğan finds Mayor İmamoğlu inordinately vexatious. Well, joining me to discuss the reasons for this is Shafak Timush, a reporter for the New York Times based in Istanbul. Shafak, first of all, let's look at the allegations against Mr. İmamoğlu and his apparently vast network of co-conspirators. What actually are the charges, and have we seen much in the way of evidence?
There are two investigations against İmamoğlu and his people around him, his close circle. One is about corruption, financial corruption, and the other is about terror. Terror is simple. It's aiding terror organization PKK, the Kurdish fighters that has been fighting with the Turkish state for the last more than 40 years. So he's not arrested for that, but that investigation is still pending. But he was put in jail, put in pretrial detention because of corruption charges. There are several charges around that, actually, which is from money laundering to taking bribes, establishing a criminal organization, being member to that criminal organization, misuse of office for having personal benefits. And then when you come to the details of those charges, you can see things like he took bribes so that he can give certain municipal bids to certain companies who are allegedly close to him personally. He took commissions from the prices of the jobs that the municipality is just giving to companies. So the corruption investigation is around that, actually.
I mean, does there seem to be actually anything to it, or does it seem more likely that, as Imamoglu and his supporters are claiming, this is all a politically motivated witch hunt?
Andrew, it is extensively believed in Turkey that this is a politically motivated investigation. And when you come to Imamoglu's side, him and his lawyers and his party, their defenses, since Imamoglu took over Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality, which is a huge money-generating machine for any party heading that, because it's a giant city of more than 15 million people, you know. So as soon as he took over that post, he was already under strict scrutiny. And that's true. We know that as a fact, too. Turkey has Court of Accounts, which is a top court. It's an actually auditing court for public institutions, including municipalities, too. So their defenses, they have been undergoing those extensive auditing process, which is regular, which is routine, by the Court of Accounts, and they didn't produce anything. Or there were Interior Ministry investigations about certain allegations, and they say they didn't yield anything concrete too. So why this now? Extensively, again, based on confidential witness testimonies, this latest investigation. These are the reasons for people who don't quite believe that this is a real investigation, but it is more politically motivated.
It's not the first time, though, that something of this sort has happened to Imamoglu. In 2022, he was, of course, sentenced to 2 years in prison. That has been suspended pending appeal for calling an election council judges fools, which does seem like a bit of an overreaction. But does this particular arrest feel different? Does it feel like there's more seriousness involved or attached to it?
This latest investigation is going hand in hand with a pro-government press campaign, as well as, in Erdogan's words too, I mean, in his latest speeches, he is also following a very similar line with the pro-government press, that they are trying to defame him as a corrupt politician who is wasting public resources, who is stealing from his people instead of serving them. Because this latest one is Erdogan's brand, right? He came to power and he stayed on power as he took an oath to serve its people. So this is what they are trying to do with this latest investigation. And this is called as character assassination by CHP, Imamoglu's party, and himself in his defense.
Well, let's talk a bit about why Imamoglu is such a large and voluble bee in President Erdogan's bonnet. What do we know of him as a politician from his stint as mayor? How and why is he different to Erdogan, who also, of course, was himself mayor of Istanbul at one point?
First of all, there's the age difference. He's young. He's very energetic. And you can see he has that spark in him. Why I'm saying this, when you watch him in the street, when he gets in touch with the regular people, you know, in the bazaar, in the marketplace, in the streets, he has that language that makes himself to be listened to. He speaks the language of the people. And you see people are just really liking him when he meets with him. And also we can see that he's very ambitious, which is very similar to Erdogan, by the way. You know, he actually beat Erdogan's party way before, when he took over this small district municipality, which is an Istanbul district, Beylikdüzü, from AK Party. You know, he just basically beat an AK Party mayor in that small district, and he became the mayor of that small district for 2 times consecutively, and then he became the Istanbul mayor. So he's actually following a similar path to Erdogan too. He's like coming from very first steps of that political ladder, from district municipality mayor then to Istanbul mayor. I think rather than differences, maybe those similarities are more of a reason to spook Erdogan away, that he is popular, that he has that similar touch, he is young. So when you look at the facts here, he's more of the future of the country than Erdogan himself, who is aging, which is a natural natural course of events.
But which brings us to the question, of course, of what a future under President İmamoğlu might look like. We are by now more than familiar with what President Erdoğan's idea of Turkey is and his vision of what Turkey should be. How would İmamoğlu's be different? What has he said about the kind of country he hopes to lead one day?
Okay, yeah, his emphasis is about democracy and judicial system, which is actually the eroding rule of law. So he promises to put that back, to empower Turkish democracy, to make Turkey democratic again, and to put back rule of law again, back on its feet, and the judiciary back on its feet, and make it earn its respect again in the eyes of the people. Also, it is again extensively believed in Turkey that judicial system is weaponized by the government and used for its political opponents or whoever is criticizing the government. So he basically promises that. They were also, the CHP and İmamoğlu, they were also arguing that they are going to go back to a parliamentary system because this new presidential system doesn't fit Turkey as a country, as Turkey has always been, it was a developing democracy. It had its problems. It was, of course, not a fully perfect democracy in many senses, but with the presidential system, the critics are arguing that it just went to another path towards authoritarianism, and academics are calling it competitive authoritarianism.
The party İmamoğlu represents is, of course, the party of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of the Turkish Republic, who was famously a very secular modernizer who wanted Turkey to be more of a collegiate European country, whereas Erdoğan has shown definite drift to a certain nostalgia for the idea of being an Ottoman sultan. Just finally on the subject of İmamoğlu, does he have a similar grandiose sense of Turkey's place on the world stage, or not so much?
To be honest, I don't know, Andrew. We couldn't come to that point to discuss it, whether just a possible İmamoğlu government and how he envisages Turkey in the world stage. I have no idea, actually. But he's making a lot of emphasis on the concept of republic. Mm-hmm. That republic means the state belongs to people. And he defends that he's going to put that back in its place too, which is eroding under Erdogan rule, under that autocratic rule. So he says things like, this is what is suiting Turkish people. Turkish people has their republic and they should keep it as it is.
That was the New York Times reporter Shafak Timosh in Istanbul. Thanks very much for joining us. This is The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. As this episode of The Foreign Desk was being assembled, further demonstrations were being planned across Turkey, and Ekrem İmamoğlu's Republican People's Party was promising they would continue until either İmamoğlu was freed or early presidential elections were called. Has President Erdoğan failed to judge the national mood? Well, joining me now is Selim Koru, an analyst at the Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey and a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Selim, first of all, let's try to see this as President Erdoğan might. Do you think he's likely to be surprised by the scale of these protests, or might this be kind of what he was hoping to provoke?
I think he'd be surprised. I think he was surprised. I think what they were going for, him and the planners probably at the presidential palace, was that they would arrest Ekrem İmamoğlu, and then, some people might protest and a lot of people might be upset, but then that the opposition would pivot over to another figure very quickly as the leader of the opposition and consequently of the CHP. People didn't do that, and people weren't really shamed by the accusations the way they thought they might be, because people didn't really lend it any credibility.
These are the accusations that not only is İmamoğlu personally corrupt, but that his followers are treacherous subversives being wound up by nefarious foreign influences, etc.
I mean, that latter point is kind of laced into the discourse in Turkey anyways. I think the thing that was supposed to shame the opposition was corruption. But the case that was put together was not persuasive at all to really anybody, I think, including a lot of people in government and sympathetic to the Erdoğan palace as well. So it didn't really have that moral impact that they were going for.
If Erdoğan has misjudged this, as you suggest, based on what we know of him, and there's quite a lot of background to work with by now, what might we anticipate will be his response? Does he have a good move, as he would see it from where he now is?
I don't think he has a very good move, to be honest. If they had some kind of a strong charge against anybody in the opposition, but especially Imamoglu, they would have done well to lead with that, right? Because then you have demoralized the other side, and it's kind of downhill from there. Whereas now, what Erdogan's been saying since this happened is that they're going to bring up more charges. And the way he talks about it doesn't really help him, right? He, just now I was listening to his speech, and he was saying, well, we are going to have other cases brought forth by our judiciary. Well, it doesn't really help you to call it our judiciary, right? Because that confirms what everybody kind of knows about what's going on.
I mean, nevertheless, is there an audience and a constituency for what Erdoğan is doing and saying now? Because clearly he doesn't lack completely popular support. He's won 3 presidential elections on the bounce. He was prime minister for a decade before that. Are those people who keep voting for him likely to stay loyal to him?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not like he's a general and wasn't really elected or anything like that, or that he became president through other means. He was repeatedly elected, an immensely popular figure in Turkey. But I think at this point, he's popular because he's powerful, rather than him being powerful because he's popular, right? So the people who support him because he's powerful and seems like he's going to last forever, rather than him being right intrinsically, or that he has a strong moral case on these individual issues.
Is that perhaps the best way of understanding what he's doing, that he understands that power is the key to his popularity and he is trying to perpetuate it perhaps beyond 2028, which is when the next presidential election is due, and in which he's not supposed to be standing because he is theoretically term limited?
Yeah. So he has dropped some hints that he would like to stay on, even though he has said in the past that this was his last election. And at least 2 other previous elections has said that it was his last election, that his supporters should come out one last time, because it's a romantic plea to them, and it plays well. But he has also said things that would hint that he would like to stay on as long as he's healthy and as long as he can do the job. But he is also, I mean, to give him credit, he is a risk taker. Right? He takes big risks, and he is politically a very, very creative person. I wouldn't put it past him to say, I'm not running in 2028 anymore, but here's this other person who will do the job. But right now, the most likely scenario is that he runs again. Yeah.
I mean, how logistically possible is that going to be? An amount of constitutional chicanery would need to be perpetrated, right?
Yes, yeah. But those things can be done, I believe.
But do you get a sense, though, really, is there anything still driving him beyond that desire to remain powerful and to remain at the centre of events? Or has he perhaps become susceptible to that affliction which I think often sets in when people have been in power too long, that they see themselves and the state as essentially indivisible. He cannot himself imagine Turkey having a future that does not revolve around him.
The way he expresses this usually is that the fate of the AK Party and the fate of Turkey are now intertwined. That's literally how he puts it. He doesn't like to put himself into that sentence all that much, but there isn't really an AK Party left. This is the party that he co-founded. People usually say that he founded it. He co-founded it with a bunch of different people. He was the most charismatic figure. He was the face of the party. But in the early years of the party, it was very much a team effort. And over time, it just happened that way, that he became more and more dominant and all the other figures became less and less significant until it was just him. And now he is by far the dominant figure. And AK Party MPs aren't really quite political, really. They're just sort of behind the great man, if you will. So, yeah, the problem of succession is a very real one that they have to deal with, I think.
So all that being said, is this, for all those reasons, potentially quite a dangerous moment? Might Erdogan be calculating that if I do retreat, if I do back down, then I do look weak, and at that point I am vulnerable?
I've heard that he talks in those terms when people challenge him on some of his policies, that he says, well, if I ever step down, they wouldn't leave my family alone. And it's not an unreasonable thing to think, I think, because there's two ways of governing, I think. There's people who expect to be in power indefinitely, and there's people who expect to hand off to somebody who doesn't like them very much, but has to get along with them. The AK Party very much these days governs in the way that they expect it to go on indefinitely, and they conduct themselves in that way.
That was Selim Koru, analyst at the Economic Policy Research Foundation in Turkey. And that's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.